Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event tonight, A World on Fire, Climate Change and Environmental Justice. When we started planning this event, we really didn't know that huge parts of our state would literally be on fire. But given the last few years, we did realize that it was a real possibility. But here we are. We're so thankful to have our speaker and moderator today. And my colleague will introduce them both in just a second. But before we do so, I'd like to say two things. First, I'd like to remind everyone that we do have some future programming coming up for the Global Policy Institute. On November 5th at 1 p.m., we'll be hosting a former alum who worked for the State Department Intelligence Agency and also the CIA previously to talk about careers in the intelligence service. And I'd also like to acknowledge our lengthy list of co-sponsors that include the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts, College of Business Administration, Seaver College of Science and Engineering, Economics Department, and the Global Economics Minor, Sociology Department, Journalism Program, Peace and Justice Studies Program, Political Science and International Relations Department, and the International Relations Program. That's a long list there. Now let me turn it over to our friend and colleague, Dan Jacobs. Dan is a senior fellow at the Global Policy Institute, and he's also a clinical associate professor of management at the College of Business Administration. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dan for those introductions.
Thank you, Professor Park, and thank you to all of you out there joining us this afternoon or this evening if you're on the East Coast. You know you're about to hear from a big-time speaker when even the person introducing the speaker gets an introduction. Bill McKibben, in addition to being an LA native, is big time. He is a distinguished professor, author, and scholar at Middlebury College in Vermont, where he tells me it's not yet snowing. But most of all, I think of Bill as an environmental activist and a world-renowned one at that. He is the leader of 350.org, a highly respected grassroots movement to fight climate change that he founded in 2008, along with 7 Middlebury alumni. So to the students and alumni in the audience, don't underestimate the potential for you and your fellow Lions to have an impact on global policy issues, beginning right now by getting involved with GPI. The president of Middlebury recently described Bill as a quiet prophet. I'm not sure I quite get the quiet part. Since the last time I saw Bill, he was shouting into a bullhorn in Lafayette Park, across from the White House, leading a protest against the Keystone XL pipeline. But I couldn't agree more with the prophet part. The goal of the protest I attended with Bill was to circle the White House. There were so many thousands of us following Prophet Bill that we could easily have circled the White House 10 times. Had we not literally reached a point of human gridlock on Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, since Bill doesn't have a bullhorn today, and we want to make sure he isn't quiet, we have enlisted as moderator another prophet, this one in the field of journalism, Carol Costello. Before coming to LMU to teach broadcast journalism, Professor Costello was an award-winning journalist and former anchor and correspondent at CNN and HLN. She also happens to be LMU's First Lady. I feel privileged to call her my colleague and my friend. Please join me in giving a big Zoom welcome to Bill McKibben and Carol Costello.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Bill, for being with us. We're very excited to hear your wisdom because climate change is of utmost importance to the LMU community and, you know, as evidenced by how many people are listening to the Zoom chat right now. So I'm just going to dive right in and ask you about 40 minutes worth of questions, and then afterwards our students will pose you some questions as well. You've been holding that bullhorn for a long time. 30 years ago, you published The End of Nature, and you essentially predicted what is happening right now to our planet. Did you, when you sat down to write that book in your mid-20s, think that people would listen and take action?
Well, you know, I was fairly naive, and I think that perhaps my theory of change in those days might have been, well, people will read my book and then they will change. But really, it turns out that's not quite how things work. In fact, Carol, I spent the next 10 years, I think, kind of laboring under the delusion that really what was going to require was more books and symposiums and speeches and articles. I thought we were having an argument, and that once the data and reason had been fully assembled, our leaders would do the right thing. And it took me probably too long to figure out that that was incorrect. You know, by about 1995, so long before your students were born, the scientific community had reached a consensus on what was going on. They knew we were heating the planet, and they knew it was going to be bad. So the argument was over, but the fight wasn't, because it turned out the fight wasn't about data and reason. The fight was about what fights are always about, money and power. And the other side in this fight, the fossil fuel industry, had plenty of both, and they were willing to use them to maintain their business model, even at the cost of breaking the planet. So that's when I moved more from just writing books to trying to do some movement building in an effort to kind of match that money and power.
Yeah, I just want you to delve into what's happened between now and then, because your latest book is called Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? That's a scary title, Bill.
Yeah.
So what's happened between those books for you to label your most current book this scary title?
Well, I mean, what were 30 years ago were warnings about what would happen if we didn't take action. You know, since we didn't take action, they've come true, and they've come true in spades. It turns out that the scientists were incorrect only in their estimation about how fast and how hard climate change was going to pinch. Scientists, by their nature, are conservative and in their work, and so it shouldn't be a great surprise that they'd underestimated. I mean, the things we're seeing that are happening now in the Arctic, with the chemistry of the oceans, on coral reefs, in fire regimes, with flooding, these are things we thought might take until the latter part of this century to show up. But in fact, they're breaking over our heads at the moment, as Angelenos know all too well.
That's for sure. Do you have personal regrets, something you should have done in the last 30 years? You're doing a lot now. I don't want to make that sound like a negative question, but do you
I think I should have, as I was sort of intimating before, I think I probably should have figured out earlier on that we were in a fight and really started to organize. Once we did, in about 10 or 12 years ago, you know, I mean, it's been arduous, but the work of building big global mass movements has gone pretty well. 350.org was a first iteration, and now happily we've been joined by Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement with the Green New Deal and Fridays for the Future, and you know, high school people know about Greta Thunberg, and they should. She's great. She's one of my favorite people. I love working with her. But there are 10,000 Gretas all over the world, and they have 10 million followers, young people who are standing up. So you know, and I think at this point, those movements have finally reached the point where they're big enough to begin eroding some of the power of the fossil fuel industry. So do I wish we'd started earlier? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of myths to bust, right? So I'm just going to pose some myths to you and you bust them, okay? So there are plenty of people out there in the United States and the world who says, look, we've had forest fire and hurricanes. We've always had them. So what makes you so sure that climate change is in part to blame for them?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, the reason that we know climate change is to blame for them is because there's a lot more of them than there used to be. You know, fire season in the American West used to be something. I mean, there used to be a period of this year when you had fires, and then a period of the year when you didn't. And now, I mean, one of the biggest fires in California history was 2 years ago in December and January. All around the world, things are burning. We just, if you look at hurricanes, we're currently well into the Greek alphabet because we ran out of letters in the normal hurricane alphabet, this year. None of this is mysterious. Climate change is not really all that hard to understand. When you burn coal and gas and oil, you produce carbon dioxide, you get methane in the atmosphere. The chemical composition of both of these molecules is such that it traps heat near the planet that would otherwise radiate back out to space. We can measure that extra heat quite easily and accurately. There's no, argument about how much there is. It's a lot because of the coal and gas and oil that we've burnt. The greenhouse gases that we've emitted trap the heat equivalent of about 4 Hiroshima-sized explosions every minute. Okay, so that's a lot of heat. That's been enough heat to melt more than half of the sea ice in the summer Arctic. I mean, think about that. That's a continent-sized, meters thick, millennia-old sheet of ice, and now it's not there anymore much of the summer. That's how much heat we've put in the atmosphere.
So we can measure all of that, but there are still climate deniers out there. In fact, when you talk about the forest fires in California, one of the things we hear from our climate denier in chief, sadly, is that the fires are really to blame for bad forest management is to blame, not really climate change.
Well, I mean, as with many things in the world, they're what academics would call overdetermined. There's plenty of things that, always cause fires, whatever else. But there's no question, among people who study this, that climate change is triggering huge increases. I mean, think about what happened in California this summer. The highest reliably recorded temperature ever on the planet came in August in California, 130 degrees at Furnace Creek. That's scary, but Death Valley is always hot. To me, the much scarier number came 2 or 3 weeks later when it got to 120 degrees at San Luis Obispo, which is, 6-7 miles from the ocean. I think it got to 115 degrees in Pasadena. Those are numbers that we would have thought impossible even a few years ago. And once you have temperatures like that, it's not like it's mysterious what happens. I mean, there are tables and charts to show how quickly grasses dry out once it gets to a certain temperature. So I mean, it's not as if any of this is some kind of arcane branch of quantum physics that is incredibly impossible for. I mean, everybody knows when it gets hot what happens.
Yet, and this question is from one of our students. There's this war on science, right? William Gibanto, this is his question. It's like, how can you convince people of all of what you said is true after the president himself stated on national television, by the way, it'll get cooler and I don't think science knows?
Well, so the good news is most people, maybe even people who vote for him, don't take President Trump very seriously about much of this stuff. I mean, he's obviously a buffoon about any number of issues, and this is one of the most obvious. So the polling data now indicates that we've reached the point where about 70% of Americans understand that climate change is real. They may not completely get the urgency and how fast we have to move, and that's something we should probably talk about, but they understand that there's a serious issue. The other 30%, I think, are going to be very hard to convince because their opposition is rooted not in science. They're not waiting for the next, publication in geophysical research letters to peruse so they can, change their mind. It's rooted purely in ideology. And if you'd spent the last 30 years, marinating in Rush Limbaugh, you'd feel the same way. So I think a way to say this is, don't wreck Thanksgiving dinner arguing with your crazy uncle about whether or not global warming is real, because you're not going to convince him. But do spend time sitting next to your sweet aunt who probably cares a lot about what's going on with her nephews and nieces and grandchildren and what their future is going to be like, and try to get her to move from the point where she's concerned about climate change to where she's willing to write some letters to a congressman, to be a little more active. That's what we're going to need, some of that 70% really standing up.
So, I do want to go back to President Trump for just a second, because you wrote in your latest book that Trump is sort of a blip in the larger story of the fossil fuel industry. And at the same time, you describe him as destructive. So help us understand that.
Here's the first way to understand it, you know. I mean, and this really does tell you the story of what happens, what kind of large-scale propaganda can do. 1988, when we first find out about climate change, the Republican president of the United States, George H.W. Bush, takes it on forthrightly, says, we're going to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. It's a pretty good line, and he seems to mean it. Fast forward 30 years, the fossil fuel industry, which we now know from great investigative reporting, knew everything there was to know about climate change in the 1980s. I mean, Exxon, biggest company in the world then, great staff of scientists. Their product was carbon. Of course, they were going to study it. They did. They found out what was happening. Their predictions that they gave their CEO for what the temperature and the CO2 concentration would be in 2020 were spot on. They were believed. Exxon started building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. But instead of telling the rest of us, Exxon and the entire industry invested huge amounts of money and effort in building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation. And they hired the veterans of the tobacco industry to do just the same thing they'd done for them, try to sow doubt and confusion about what we knew. So 30 years later, after untold hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on this project, the president of the United States no longer says we're going to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. This time the Republican president says climate change is a hoax manufactured by the Chinese, and I think it's going to get cold soon. That's how propaganda works. Now, why is it so destructive that Trump is doing this right now at this moment? Why is this election so important? It's because climate change is unlike other issues that we face, in that it is really the first timed test that humans have come up against. Most of the issues, Carol, that we deal with in our political life are things that are kind of perennially there, and we make some progress and come back again. We have a big problem with medical care, so we get Obamacare, and it covers another 20 million people, and maybe another few years we'll actually have Medicare for all and cover a lot more people, whatever. But it takes a while, and you make progress, and sometimes you backslide, and you get a new Supreme Court justice who strikes down Obamacare. Okay, that's tragic and hard, but that's how politics works. Climate change isn't like that. If we don't solve it soon, we will not solve it, because we will go past physical tipping points from which there is no retreat. No one has a plan for refreezing the Arctic, and so the fact that we're really up against a time curve now is of the utmost importance.
So how much damage has the president done in your mind, being an environmental activist? Because he's also had the EPA roll back more than 100 environmental regulations.
He's done a tremendous amount of damage, but mostly because of this timing question. We came out of the Paris Climate Accords in 2015 with a bit of momentum. And the hope was, because the Paris Climate Accords were insufficient in their pledges and promises, that momentum would translate into faster action than predicted by many countries. And that action's possible because the engineers, many of them in California, have done a tremendous job in driving down the price of solar power and wind power. It's now the cheapest power on Earth. So there was beginning to be a kind of virtuous cycle building. That cycle was interrupted by Trump, who was purely in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry, done every possible thing that they've asked, rolled back every law, stopped every effort to And but the damage is most important because it's cost us the one thing that's most precious, which is time. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the international group of scientists who work on this question, put out their most recent report, and it was the first one with a really hard deadline. It said that if by 2030 we hadn't made fundamental transformations in our energy system, and they defined that phrase to mean cutting emissions by about half by 2030, then our chances of meeting the targets we'd set in Paris were essentially nil. So you know as much about how politics works as I do, and economics. If you want to do a very large job in 10 years, you can't wait until year 9. You better be doing all you can in year 1 to try, and that's precisely what we haven't been doing.
Right.
And that's why it's, it would be utterly devastating to our physical situation were Trump reelected.
Yeah, I'm going to get into the fossil fuel industry a little bit later, but I just want to stick on this politicization of climate change or global warming. This question is from Veronica BP from the LA Loyolan. And she wonders, and I'm sure many students do, how did climate change become politicized? How did science itself become so politicized that people don't believe scientists any longer?
Veronica, very good question. And the answer is very interesting because it wasn't always thus. For most of the 20th century, environmentalism was a fairly bipartisan preoccupation. Even as late as 1970, though he was not an environmentalist, your fellow Californian Richard Nixon did sign the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, because so many people were demanding that he take action that he really had no choice. So, what happened after that was basically that the fossil fuel industry bought itself a political party. I mean, look at, for instance, the Koch brothers, our biggest oil and gas barons, and also by far, the biggest political players in the country. The last presidential election cycle, the Koch brothers, 2 guys, spent more money than the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee combined, okay? So that's how it got politicized, and it's a shame that it has because there's, in the end, very little that's political about it. I mean, there are many things that are in our lives that are ideological, and I guess should be because they're about matters of opinion. I think people should get paid $30 an hour because that's a living wage. You think that there should be no minimum wage at all. We meet in the middle at 15 and we come back and fight it out again a few years later, Okay. But in this case, the fight really isn't at its base, Veronica, between Republicans and Democrats, between industrialists and environmentalists. The fight at base is between human beings and chemistry and physics. And that's a very tough fight to win. Chemistry and physics, not good at compromise, not skilled at negotiation. They just do what they do.
But still, Bill, and I want to interject here because, I understand the fossil fuel industry has hired lobbyists, and I understand how politicians would listen to the lobbyists, and I understand all that. But a part of me says, it's easy to blame those entities and kind of leave scientists out of the mix. Isn't it aren't scientists in part to blame for being unable to effectively get their message across and what was happening to our planet?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, scientists are not all of them are tremendously skilled at public relations, but they've done their job. I mean, they took an extremely difficult problem in physics and chemistry and broke it down. And by 1995, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had stated quite clearly what was going on, who was to blame, how we needed to fix it.
There was a time in this country where Americans admired scientists and believed what they said, and they don't any longer. And I know everything's politicized.
Well,
but
the polling data shows that actually Americans still do admire scientists and trust them. But mean, scientists don't have, hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on TV commercials. There's not like a, every time you turn on the TV. I mean, let me give you an example. Washington State, I'll give you a better example. Colorado, 2 years ago, had a referendum about whether or not, not to ban fracking, but whether or not you could just restrict it so that it wasn't really in people's front yards and in schoolyards and things, okay? All the scientists explained why this was a good idea. It had to do with climate change. It had to do with having to breathe the fumes from this stuff. All the same things that apply in LA, by the way, one of the few big cities in the world where we still do oil drilling right in the middle of the city, right next to the poorest and most vulnerable communities. But at any rate, in Colorado, scientists were doing all this, and people were clearly going to vote in favor of this restrictions on fracking in people's neighborhoods. The thing was up 60 or 65%. Then the fossil fuel industry spent $50 million. They spent more money than anybody had ever spent on any political effort in Colorado history by a mile. I was there towards the end of it, and they'd run out of, there was no more TV time to buy, so they had hired trucks to tow billboards up and down the highway, okay? They outspent proponents of this ban 50-1, and so they managed to win a narrow victory. That's not the fault of scientists. I mean, if you gave them $50 million to work with, they would have won, but no one does, Sometimes you hear people say, oh, scientists are just doing this in order to, make money or to get their grant money or something. I mean, that seems the most unlikely of right-wing talking points if you've ever met a fossil fuel executive and a climate scientist. I will just add that that really is something when I'm in Los Angeles that strikes me over and over and over again. I really hope, people have campaigned super hard to get Governor Brown and now Governor Newsom to stop oil drilling within, 2,500 feet of people's homes and schools. And I have no idea why California, one of the richest places in the world where the oil industry is now a mere blip on the economy, continues to allow that kind of environmental racism to permeate the state. It's horrible in LA, it's horrible in Kern County, and shame on Newsom for not standing up to it.
Well, there's a conundrum there, right? Because Governor Newsom just came out with this idea to ban, he wants all electric cars sold in California by 2035.
He and Brown have both been good on the demand side, partly because it's nicely in the future, but they've been terrible on the supply side. They're unwilling to stand up to the oil companies. So credit to him for doing the right thing about electric cars. That'll be a big deal. Shame on him for not doing what he can easily do to protect Californians.
About the electric cars, maybe he won't be governor in 2035. It's likely he won't be. So
I don't think he
will
can
that even be
unless you change your
I never
term
say anything. I never say never anymore, Bill.
You're not going to be.
And then you can still buy gas-powered cars in other parts of the country. So does it really matter?
Oh, it completely matters. I mean, A, how many people do you ever know who went to some other state to buy a car? But B, California, I mean, in essence, by doing this, California will ensure that the rest of the country is doing the same thing. The auto industry is not going to have a whole separate wing for California. They're going to, and other states will follow them. More to the point, California, I mean, who defined historically car culture, not just in the United States, but in the entire world? I mean, where did we get the muscle car, the dune buggy, the convertible, the traffic jam? Where did every image we have of car culture on planet Earth come from? It came from the golden state of California. So merely the psychological impact of California saying, yeah, you know what, we don't need the internal combustion engine anymore is a big deal.
About the fires, I just want to go back and touch on those, because what is the answer there? Friends of mine, actually, it's an LMU family, their winery burned down and their ancestral home. They're going to rebuild if anyone will insure them. That made me wonder if maybe it's too late and they shouldn't rebuild because the fires aren't going to end anytime soon.
Yeah, truthfully, one of the things I said in this last book of mine was the boundaries of human habitation on this planet are clearly now shifting. And there are going to be fairly large swaths of the earth that are going to be not easily habitable by humans. Big story today in the paper, in the New York Times, about how property values in coastal Florida are suddenly dropping and dropping sharply because buyers have come to realize that who wants to buy a house that's going to get blown over and flooded in the next hurricane? I have a feeling probably some of the same holds for Napa and Sonoma, some of the most beautiful places in the world. But there does.
So is it too late for those areas then? Is it too late?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's a question that depends a lot on particular topography and particular situations and so on and so forth. But clearly, the temperature is not going to get any lower. It's going to get higher, even if we do everything right at this point. And so it's going to be. I mean, I'm afraid that there's that people are going to. I mean, California is if it represented anything to the entire world, it represented a kind of idyll of relaxation, of kind of chill, of cool, And I'm afraid now, when summer comes, and it comes earlier and earlier, for Californians, it's going to represent a long season of tension every year.
91 degrees here in Westchester today, I know that. I want to focus on the fossil fuel industry because there seems to be positive news coming from that sector of our economy. BP's CEO Bernard Looney told Axios that he's pivoting BP from being an international oil company that we've been for 111 years, he said, to becoming an integrated energy company. Looney says BP has budgeted $6.5 million toward climate policies and would gladly spend millions more if there were viable net zero policies to actively advocate for. Do you believe him?
Well, BP feels like it may be the first of the major oil companies to capitulate. And if they are, it's because people have mounted this intense decade-long campaign to force the oil company's hand. I mean, I helped start the fossil fuel divestment campaign, which we should talk about. We're at $15 trillion now worth of endowments and portfolios that refuse to invest in fossil fuels anymore. That's put enormous pressure on these guys. And that pressure is stronger in Europe, where regulators, there's no Trump, the EU is working hard to push these guys in the right direction. So BP may have actually capitulated. They've said that they're going to cut oil and gas production 40% in the next decade. If true, that would be a big change. We're going to have to watch them because BP actually tried this once before. In the 1990s, they announced that British Petroleum was no longer their name and BP now stood for Beyond Petroleum. But they never did anything about it. They spent more money redesigning their logo than they did investing in actual renewable energy. And about 10 years later, they just gave it up and said, we're going back into the oil gas business. And the first thing they did was, blow up the Deepwater Horizon well in the Gulf of Mexico. So they bear watching, but I think that's changing. The American oil companies haven't begun to budge, and Exxon secret documents revealed last week showed that Exxon plans to increase emissions 17% over the next couple of years, which
although
kind of defines irresponsibility.
Although there are all signs that big oil is paying a price for ignoring the planet, for profit. Yep. Exxon and Chevron are receding in the rearview mirror of the Next Era Energy, Inc., and that would be the biggest producer of wind and solar energy. That's big, isn't it?
It's huge. They're bigger now than Exxon. And that is a reminder of where we're going, because it wasn't but 15 years ago that Exxon was the biggest company on earth, never mind the biggest energy company on earth, okay? And as someone who's gone to jail to try and cut them down to size, it makes me very happy to see this happening. but we need to keep pushing and very hard because they maintain outsized political influence. So let's talk for a minute about that divestment campaign, because this is a place where Loyola Marymount could be a huge help. You know, institutions of all kinds around the world have divested from fossil fuel, including many of the great educational institutions on the planet. The University of California system being one of the biggest, divesting its $80 billion in pensions and endowments, but many, many others. Most recently, probably the two most famous educational institutions on earth, Oxford and Cambridge, each divesting. And not only that, Catholic institutions around the country have divested, including, say, Georgetown. And the reason's pretty clear. As the Pope repeated for about the 100th time this week, everybody should divest from fossil fuel because these are rogue companies that don't deserve our support. So now would be a really good time for LMU to join in on this fight and demonstrate that it, you know, was putting its money where it's, well, where its theology is.
No, it's, and divestiture is certainly proven effective, right? And pressuring these oil companies to do the right thing. Some have this idea. I mean, should governments tax cheap fossil fuels to make them more expensive than clean alternatives? Governments can easily do that.
Yeah,
I don't want to say easily, but
carbon, I mean, economists have argued for 3 decades that a price on carbon makes sense. And I mean, it clearly makes no sense to let the fossil fuel industry, you know, pollute for free. Like, why should they get to use the atmosphere as an open sewer in which to just dump their garbage? No one else does. I mean, you know, the dining hall at LMU, you know, the cheapest way to get rid of its food waste would be just to shovel it out in the street, you know. We don't do that because if we did, you'd have rats and there'd be leptospirosis and whatever. So part of being civilized is you clean up after yourself. And that's the law in California and every place else, except if you're the fossil fuel industry. Now, that said, you know, 30 years ago, a modest carbon tax might well have been enough to turn around this super tanker, you know. It would have steered it a few degrees to port, and 30 years later, we would be in an entirely different ocean. Now, having waited this long and with this much ground to make up, there's no way that a carbon tax alone can do this job. So we're going to have to do, if we have one, it's going to have to be as part of a suite of policies, and we can't trade away those other policies in order to get a carbon tax at this point.
I'd just like to focus a little bit on Joe Biden. He says he doesn't fully embrace the Green New Deal, but he embraces aspects of it. And I think it's very confusing for people to figure out where he is in the fight on global warming. Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he's way further along than Donald Trump is, and not as far along as physics and chemistry require. But I think the obvious reason to elect him is that you can then move him in the right direction. You know, I mean, it's not like if you elect him, you get to go home and never do anything again. You know, I worked hard to elect Barack Obama, and then, you know, I organized what turned out to be the biggest demonstrations, I think, outside the White House in Obama's tenure, which were these ones that, you know, that Dan's referring to about the Keystone Pipeline. You gotta, you gotta keep pushing even after you've elected somebody. But clearly he's open to progress on it. And some of the things he's gonna do from day one, he's already said, and we know fracking on public lands in the US, that's a big deal. As Californians know, public lands make up a lot of the country. Public lands in the US, were they their own nation, would be the 5th largest carbon emitter on the planet. So that's a big start. And
but he's not eliminating all fracking. There's plenty of, right?
No, he's not.
But because he also needs to win over those Midwestern voters in states like Pennsylvania. So it's a politicized issue there, isn't it?
Yeah, I actually think politically they'd be smart to be stronger than they are on this stuff, because every poll shows that actually this is a big winner. People really are concerned about climate change. But, and you know, it's not like not like Biden was my first choice. I'm a Vermonter, you know. You can figure out who I, you know, have been working for a long time. But that said, I mean, what a relief it'll be to have a normal human being who, you know, understands that science is an actual thing. I mean,
Well,
think what a relief it'll be for scientists not to have some guy up there saying, "Oh, science doesn't know what it's talking about. It's going to get colder soon." I mean,
so
you know,
just,
this
just
will
to
be
go back to
simply,
fracking for just a minute, just because I'm from
yes,
rural America and, you know, my family is involved in fracking because the independent small farmer can't make it economically.
Carol,
You say to
where are
them,
they located?
Minerva, Ohio. So we're
Ohio.
close to Carrollton, Ohio, where there's,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
huge, right. So to them, when environmentalists say we're going to eliminate all fracking right now, that's their livelihood at the moment. And you can't just pull the rug out from under them, can you?
Well, we need, obviously, I mean, what everyone said for years is we need what's called a just transition for people who are involved through no fault of their own in the fossil fuel industry, coal miners, oil field workers, on and on and on. And every effort to deal with climate change that the Democrats have put forward for decades has had lots of money for that kind of just transition, that kind of retraining. I just wrote a piece for the New Yorker about oil field workers in North Dakota. Now that the oil bust is on there, they're being retrained and very happily to be wind turbine technicians. It turns out to be a better job in a lot of ways. But the reason we don't have these kind of just transition laws is because the Republicans figured out a long time ago that it would be politically advantageous to them essentially to hold the fossil fuel workers as hostages. And that's what, you know, when you see Trump going on and on about coal miners, endlessly having coal miners in the Oval Office, that's what he's doing. He hasn't managed to protect the coal industry. It's still in decline, but I mean, those are like hostage videos, you know?
But it's effective, right?
We'll see on November 3rd. My guess is that Pennsylvania's had it up to here with him. And it looks to me like Ohio's in play in a way that people would not have suspected even a few months ago. So I'm not sure
I
how
don't know if it's because of the
effective.
environment though, but we'll see.
Well, look, I mean, there are people who've been really good about this. Sherrod Brown, for instance, in Ohio, who've really been quite forthright about the time has come to make some changes here.
It is now, I've done 40 minutes, so I'm going to switch to some student questions if you don't mind.
Fantastic.
Bill. Lots of good ones. Okay, this is from James Castillo. He says, if climate change cannot be reversed, who is more responsible for mitigating the negative effects climate change has caused to our communities? The corporations with poor practices or the consumers who support them?
Very good question, James. So first of all, let's talk about who gets hit hardest, because we've talked a lot about, you know, Napa and Sonoma today, and that's true. They're getting hit hard. But it's also true that the iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the more likely you are to get hit hard and fast by the effects. So it's the poorest, most vulnerable people around California, but around the planet, that are taking this in the teeth. Now, there are plenty of things that each of us can do as individuals to help. I'm proud of the fact that there's solar panels up on the roof. That's how I'm talking to you here tonight on my house, you know, on and on. But I'm well aware that, you know, I don't try to fool myself. At this point, we do not solve the deepest problem we've ever faced, one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. You can't make the math work in the time we have that way. So the important thing is for individuals to become a little bit less individual, to join together with others in movements big enough to make real change. Students right now have a great opportunity to do that because one of the really powerful movements in America is composed of people under the age of 30. It's the Sunrise Movement. They're wonderful. I know most of them, the leaders, because they cut their teeth on fossil fuel divestment campaigns in college. Varshini Prakash, the woman who leads this effort, was the woman who divested UMass, the University of Massachusetts, a few years ago. But they're the ones who came up with the Green New Deal, and they're doing amazing work. And so I highly recommend throwing down with them.
Okay, and that leads me to this. I know you answered some of that, but a lot of students are asking the same questions. What can we do?
Here's
as
another thing.
active citizens, other than voting? Like, what
Right.
can we do?
So you got to join organizations like Sunrise that are pushing the government around. But you also got to remember that it's not just the government that we need to target. Washington's really important, but Washington's just one capital. It doesn't really rule the world anymore. And even at its best, it moves pretty slowly. So that's one of the reasons I've spent a lot of time in the last few years trying to figure out how we also target Wall Street. Part of that's with these big divestment campaigns, which have been effective. But in the last 2 years, we've also gone on to take on the big banks and asset managers that are the kind of financial lifeline for the coal and gas and oil companies. So we've had huge campaigns against BlackRock, against JP Morgan Chase, against Bank of America. And these are beginning to tell as these companies begin to shift. And this is another place where young people can have a huge effect. These guys are scared if they see people organizing saying, I'm never going to take out a Bank of America credit card in my life, because they know that the habits, financial habits people form when they're 21 are likely to last for decades. So join in at efforts like stopthemoneypipeline.com, which are all about trying to leverage the financial system. If we push hard on both Washington and Wall Street, we may get somewhere in the next few years.
Another question from a student who is watching right now. They wonder about the role of big tech companies. I mean, what role do major companies like Amazon and Google, et cetera, play in climate change? And how can we get them all on the same page as us?
Excellent question. And it's very much in play because they're beginning to feel real pressure to do things. So for instance, people put good pressure on Amazon, and Amazon began to say things like, we're going to get all electric trucks for deliveries and things like that. Google and Apple have been good about saying, we're going to power all our server farms with renewable energy, so on and so forth. Those things are good. Even more important would be getting those companies to put their lobbying muscle behind the things that need to happen in Washington to make real change. These are the companies with the most lobbying power of all, you know, and if the Bezoses of the world were demanding that Congress take action on climate change, well, they'd be a powerful counterweight to the Koch brothers and others.
Another question from a student. This is from Alex Sanchez. With climate change being a pressing issue, have you seen corporations change to improve their environmental impact on their own, or do they wait to be regulated by the government in order to implement change?
So most corporations, I'm afraid, only do what they're forced to do. And that force can come from two places. One is from government regulation, and the other is from some perceived consumer pressure. And when they get those things, then they shift. Sometimes they shift a little, and we call it greenwashing, and they make small cosmetic gestures. Sometimes you get to them and they shift a lot. And increasingly, I think it's possible that more will be shifting in big ways because the economics of change are becoming clearer and clearer and clearer. I mean, at this point, it's economically stupid to continue backing the fossil fuel industry.
On that note, another question from a student about nuclear power. Do you support a transition to nuclear power? My understanding is that modern nuclear plants out of France are basically safe. So is that the key?
So, nuclear power is a really interesting question. And it produces, obviously, less carbon, very little, in fact. So in climate terms, it's good. And the trouble is, besides the trouble that you know about around safety and danger, the other problem is it's super expensive. So as I told you, the price of a solar panel, wind turbines dropped about 90% in the last decade, but the price of nuclear power plants just keeps going up and up and up. And I think the reason they keep going up and up, Alex, is that that you have to, they're kind of an old paradigm. You get a big, huge pile of concrete someplace with, it takes billions of dollars to build and decades to build. And then you run wires out of it, and it's a very 1950s model about how you produce power. increasingly power is being produced more like we produce, sort of the internet. Everybody's both a producer and a consumer. We have millions of nodes on people's roofs and small solar farms, individual wind turbines, all of that creating power, and it's going back and forth in every direction. That said, I think it would be a mistake to close down existing nuclear power plants if they're relatively safe. And I think that it's possible. People I really trust, like Jim Hansen, the great climate scientist, keep saying that there's another generation of nuclear power plants on the way that are small and cheap and safe. And as those arise, perhaps the equation will change. But for the next decade, I think it's pretty clear that sun and wind are the key technologies. They're technologically magic. I mean, the fact that you can point a sheet of glass at the sun and out the back comes light and coolness and information. I mean, that's Hogwarts scale magic, and we should celebrate it and embrace it and put it up as fast as we can.
This question is from Daniel Oladin. How feasible do you think achieving all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are for countries like the US, China, and India, who produce the most pollution in the world? What would be your pitch to get them on board and start working toward some of these goals?
So that's a really good question. And there are a lot of countries that really are working on these SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as the UN calls them. And we've been making some progress on them, eliminating, reducing the level of absolute poverty, that kind of thing. Sadly, we've gone into reverse over the last 3 or 4 years. This is one of the things I write about in my most recent book. The number of hungry people is now going up instead of down. The number of children and child laborers is going up instead of down. And this year, that has something to do with COVID, but this predated it. And it's largely because the level of natural disaster keeps going up. And there's nothing that destroys, the fabric of a poor community more than a hurricane. Or, I mean, think how disastrous it is in California, in a town like St. Helena or saying when a fire burns through. Now try to imagine that in a place with no wealth and no resilience and no ability to rebuild and nobody coming in with aid to help and on and on and on. And you get a sense of just how desperate this situation is. That's why the UN estimates that we could see 1 billion climate refugees on the move by the middle of the century. If that happens, the chances for any kind of stable planet are gone.
This is a question from the audience about agriculture. Agriculture, especially animal agriculture, is cited as being a major contributor to climate change. What can be done on this front?
This is correct. We think that agriculture is about 18% of emissions. That's what the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has said. And that's a lot. And the bulk of that comes from livestock, especially cows, far and away the biggest source, both because they, belch a lot of methane and so on, but mostly because you have to grow a huge amount of corn to feed them, and because increasingly we cut down rainforests in order to pasture more of them. So one thing we can do is eat less of them. If buying supermarket beef is not a good idea, and almost anything that you could eat instead is better. Same goes for a Big Mac, But oddly, there's beginning to be a sense that there probably are ways to do agriculture, including raising animals, in ways that could make soils more, soak up more carbon and more methane. And this is really interesting. People who are curious about it should look up regenerative agriculture. The science is still fairly new, but it's fascinating. In a few places, France in particular, have begun to experiment with paying farmers to increase the amount of carbon in their soils. This is not a silver bullet because it's A, the science is iffy, but B, it's just hard. I mean, we take oil companies, really powerful, so the hit side is limited. There's 1 billion farmers on the planet, so it's difficult to change cultural and agricultural practices as quickly as one might hope.
And this will probably be the last question, but I did want to ask you about the Supreme Court. Amy Coney Barrett, of course, she's being cross-examined right now, and she was asked about climate change. And her answer, at least part of her answer, was, I'm not a scientist. I've read about it. But decisions in the Supreme Court are likely to affect the fight for climate change, right?
Absolutely. So first of all, let's just talk for a minute about how disingenuous she's being there. She's obviously an extremely bright woman. She's a law professor at Notre Dame. To say, I'm not a scientist, so I don't really know what's going to happen with global warming, is akin to saying, I'm not an astronomer, so I can't figure out if it's a good idea if an asteroid slams into the Earth or not. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And everybody watching it knows that it's ridiculous and that she's just parroting a right-wing talking point to avoid, angering the people who got her where she is. And I'm afraid that it, presages precisely the fact that when, as they inevitably will, many cases come before the Supreme Court on climate change, she, like many of her brethren there on the court, will rule in favor of the corporations that in effect bankrolled their presence on the court. And that's a very sad thing to say. One should be able to have more faith in our institutions. But when you see displays of disingenuousness like that, really, in a sense, a lack of intellectual honor. Anybody who at this point, any educated person who says, I have no idea, I don't really know anything about climate change, is clearly not telling you the truth. And that lack of intellectual rigor and intellectual honor is, well, it's the kind of thing that could make people cynical. And cynicism is one of the things that we have to fight against, but there are moments when it's very hard in this country right now.
I think you're correct on that. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn the program back over to Dan so he can say goodbye. And this has been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate it.
Carol, I would just like to say that you're very, very good at this. And what a pleasure it was to get to talk with you. And what a pleasure it was to get to talk by proxy with students there, and what good questions those were. And do keep a little pressure on LMU to do the right thing with its investments. It's all very good to talk about this, but if, the university is still trying to make money off global warming, that's not okay. Don't believe me, ask the Pope.
Thank you so much. Dan?
Oh, what a great note to end on. Ask the Pope. I think I'll end some of my classes that way in the future. Why listen to me? Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you so much, Bill. And thank you to all the students, faculty, and alumni who joined us today. Have a very good evening.